Beaumaris all his early years. He was at school at Scotch College, and he got a degree in physio at La Trobe, 1991. That's what the records say anyway. Yeah. He did a postgraduate diploma in sports physiotherapy later, after working in private practice in physio. Paul took a job with tennis professionals, Associated Tennis Professionals, which is the group that is involved in all of the major tennis tournaments around the world. And you've probably also, if those of you who are tennis watchers of certainly the Australian Open and any of the other Opens, have probably seen Paul come onto the court when the trainer is sent for. So when a trainer comes on, he's called the trainer, but he's really the physio, to attend to the player on court. Then it's often Paul, and I saw you once this time. I think it was when that South Korean guy was playing, and he was having trouble with his feet and his legs. So Paul will give us the lowdown on tennis today and his profession. Please welcome Paul Ness.
Thank you, gentlemen. It was a little bit of a step back in time for me to come here today. I read through the names on your membership list and recognised quite a few, and it almost made me feel like I was back in primary school at Beaumaris Primary. I see quite a few of the parents that the kids that I was at school with back then. So it is quite amazing to be back here after so many years. Aside from actually growing up here and going to school at Beaumaris Primary, this actual location was where I started my sports physiotherapy, in the old building, of course. My first job was with Beaumaris Football Club many, many years ago, so it is quite good fun to be back here and amongst some familiar faces. Ken asked me to talk a little bit about tennis, and he came up with this catch cry of "send for the trainer," and that is what you hear on the TV mostly. And this is one of my favourite pictures, working with the greatest of all time, who has just recently returned to #1 in yet another record. But I wanted to go through a little bit about what trainer means. Now, obviously, I'm not that sort of trainer. I don't train monkeys. And as physios, we do get a little frustrated with the word trainer. So what is the origin of trainer? It's actually an American term, and that's why we hear Jim Courier and John McEnroe, who are often commentating, talk about the trainer coming on court. There is a degree in America that is called a certified athletic trainer, and it's sort of like a lower level physio course. They don't do a lot of the chest physiotherapy or the neurological physio, and it was designed mostly for the huge college and high school structure that they have over there. Physios are too expensive for colleges and high schools to employ, so they decided to develop this new course, which was more or less a streamlined, very basic physiotherapy. And originally, when tennis evolved in the professional scene and they needed someone to look after the injuries, they did employ mostly American trainers, and that's why we get the term trainer thrown around a lot. Now, what is the reality these days? All of us are a group of really highly trained physios. Most of us have some sort of specialist background in sports of a whole variety of different kinds. When I started with the ATP, it was a group of 6 of us that was full-time travelling the tour. We now have 19 physios to cover the increased demands. A little bit about me. I studied physiotherapy at La Trobe University, as Ken said. And then started to cut my teeth in the real world. I think most of you have probably heard a lot about university. It gives you the piece of paper to then start practicing and learning the real stuff. It is pretty much the same in physiotherapy. They probably shouldn't let us loose on patients straight away. And that was part of why I joined up at Beaumaris Football Club as actually a trainer, because it was before I was qualified, and we do have sports medicine trainers that do all the taping and that sort of thing. So during my second year or third year as a physio student, I did start down here with Beaumaris Football Club every Saturday morning doing the reserves and then the seniors, doing 25 ankles before every match and running out onto the ground and making sure guys were okay, sometimes even having to carry the water and messages from the coach. I worked with a large range of sports just to try and get a really broad experience as much as I could. That middle picture is Vic Vision Soccer, which was the women's Victorian soccer team back in the early days when women's soccer was just developing. I also tried my hand at American football, not playing, that would be silly, but I had a friend of mine who was an American football player with one of the local clubs, Croydon, and he asked me to come down and help out with their state team as well. And that has obviously been good for me because we have a group of fantasy footballers in American football, and I'm currently the back-to-back champion of that fantasy football team. I then studied my postgrad diploma of sports physio, which is now called a Masters in Sports Physio, but I have studied a long time ago, and way back then we didn't have a master's program. It was called a postgraduate diploma, so that was as good as I could do. And during that time we had to get a lot of experience. We spent some time at the Institute of Sport with all the really elite sports physios at the time. We also had to do a sports team placement at a national level, and I am a Carlton fan, so I gave the Carlton physio a call. Back in the good old days when we were actually winning premierships. And I spent a season down there, which was quite enlightening to see how football was working and what it was like in the rooms. I have spent some time with table tennis as well. You might laugh about table tennis and sport and how high level it is. I actually believe that table tennis players probably train harder than most other sports from what I've seen. I worked with them at the Commonwealth Games in Manchester. I also did a lot of work with triathlon because I was a triathlete in my 20s, and travelled with the national duathlon team for a little while. How I got into tennis was purely a right time, right place scenario, as many jobs are. The guy that I worked with at Carlton Football Club just happened to be a physio at the Australian Open. I didn't realise that at the time. I did my year with him at Carlton, and then at the end of the year he gave me a call. So that's where I started my introduction to tennis, Australian Open 1997. I was called the local. There were two of us, and we joined together with I think we had 2 or 3 ATP physios or trainers come around and look after the tournament. So my role was purely 3 weeks in January, which worked really well for me because I was a part owner of Box Hill Physiotherapy at the time, and January's our quiet month. So for me to go away for that time and do a bit of sporting interest stuff kept all the physios at Box Hill Physio reasonably busy, and I was able to go back onto some real sports stuff in the low time for a practice. As a local, you wouldn't have seen me on court though. The local physios don't come onto court. It's purely a backup service for all the extra treatments in the room. I continued to do that 3 weeks in January for probably 6 or 7 years. During that time I got to know a few of the ATP guys, though from a range of countries at that time. I was lucky enough that one of them liked me and he became the boss. So my next step was to be given a call and say, do you want to do a few weeks? I discussed it with my partner at Box Hill, and he thought it was a good idea to get a bit of exposure for us. It paid okay. It was paid in US dollars. The Australian dollar was fairly low at the time, so that was some good income for the clinic. And we thought it was a good way of me spreading my patients around the rest of the clinic, because I would go away for a couple of weeks at a time and try and redirect my patients onto the junior physios, try and get the patients to see them and realise that they're actually okay too. So my first event was at a place in Scottsdale, Arizona, which is a little tournament that no longer exists. It was right at the end of February, start of March, and my then boss said, email this lady, Kathy, get your airfare, email this person to get a lift from the airport to the hotel, and then there'll be transport there to take you from the hotel to the tournament, and your supplies will be at the tournament. That was my introduction to working on the tennis tour. I knew no one. I didn't know what the processes were. All I knew was how to treat patients. Fortunately, as a physio for the Australian Open, I did do the junior tournament, and I did do court calls for the juniors, so I knew a little bit about the rule, at least, for what I should do if I was called on court. I was still full-time at Box Hill during that time, as I said, so that meant that I was pretty busy, because in general I needed to get back to the clinic fairly quickly, so it would be a matter of finish work on Thursday, fly on Friday, get to America on Friday, start working on Saturday, do however many weeks in a row, fly back, start the next day. Not much downtime. Then the opportunity was presented to me, full time. That's how I felt. So I thought it's not a bad idea. What does full time involve? It could sound glamorous. You only work 22 weeks. You get these free business class flights, fine dining, great hotels, lots of money. Well, let's tell you a little bit about some of the reality of what that full time really is. 22 weeks is what we call 22 tournament weeks. Now, for those of you who don't know much about tennis, you usually see a tennis tournament that starts on a Monday and finishes on a Sunday. Well, we actually have a qualifying event for those one-week tournaments on the Saturday and Sunday prior to main draw. So that means you have to be there on Friday to start Saturday, to work through to the following Sunday, and leave Monday if you're just doing a one-week event. So that 1 week, if you take into account travel, can more often than not be 10 days. So your 22 weeks roughly adds up to about 170 days of work away. So that means that my calendar looked much like this for a month. Not many days off there. But at the same time, which I wasn't used to as when I was in private practice, I did get chunks of time in between. So say for example this Australian Open in January, I worked the full 3 weeks, no days off, long days, but then as soon as I finish, I've got a chunk of time off. So I went on holiday with my wife a couple of days after the Australian Open finished. We got back on Sunday. I'm in town until next Friday. So that whole chunk of time is what we call off. For a full-timer, quite often you don't have too many extra duties, but you have to make sure that you've booked your flights and your hotels for the next tournament. There's some emails to keep in touch with, there's some projects going on. But all in all, it means that you do have fairly significant chunks of time off the road. And as a physio, when I was in the clinic, as an owner, we really had to work 48 to 50 weeks out of the 52 each year just to make sure that the income was coming into the clinic. Business class travel was a complete misnomer. And even to this day, we still all have to travel economy. It's only the top guys who fly in on a particular day, work that day for a couple of meetings, fly out the next day. They do get to fly business. So our travel budget would just be completely blown out of the water if we did fly business. I don't get my knees jammed up against the seat in front of me too much like that because I'm not super tall. And if you do work full time, you do end up trying to get some status with an airline, and that can help you get some at least premium economy seating. Or in my case, because I fly so many miles, because I live so far away from many of the events, I do actually qualify with United Airlines to get 6 free international upgrades a year. So I do get to spread out a little bit, but it's not a given, that's for sure. Fine dining. You call this fine dining? You might get a fine breakfast in the hotel, but more often than not, tournaments are day and night sessions. So you see lots of hot bain-maries and you see lots of salad bars. If you're on a bit of a rotating roster and you do get an evening off, then you can get out for a reasonable meal. But when you get off early, you're actually pretty happy just to go back to the hotel and get some room service a lot of the time. Great hotels. We did get lucky with that one. A lot of the tournaments are sponsored by very good hotels. So I've stayed at places like the Waldorf Astoria in New York. The Westin, that picture on the bottom right is from the rooftop bar at the Washington DC Westin overlooking the White House. And the one on the bottom left is for a tournament that I've done a couple of times in Acapulco. We stay at a beach club on the beach. So we do get lucky there, and as physios we pay for our own hotels and then get it reimbursed. And the bonus of that is that we get the points. So I'm a Hilton Diamond member and a Marriott Gold member, and we get quite a few free hotel nights.
What millionaire?
Dollars? Well, I'm an employee of a company, a not-for-profit association. That means it's not massive dollars. Saying that, as an employee in a physio clinic in Australia, you're not likely to make great money. So I'm probably doing about 50% better than what most of your employee physios are doing. So why did I want to do full-time? Well, professionally, it's ultimately challenging. We get these athletes that come off the court and they've won, and they've got a bit of an injury, and they have to play again tomorrow, or best case scenario in 2 days' time. So you've got to do everything you can, which sometimes means pulling rabbits out of the hat to get them ready for the next day. Great team. The group of physios that I started with full-time 10 years ago was a rabble. Me and my boss have chosen really carefully who we employ over the years, and as tennis has become a more physical game, we've needed more coverage at tournaments. So a lot of the little tournaments that I have worked in the past, you work solo. Now we have at least 2 physios at every event. So our team has grown from a rabble of 6. We got rid of a few guys and we're up to a team of 19 now, and they're a really good bunch of guys. We all get along very well together. We're all highly trained. We share a lot of information about how to treat things differently, and because we come from different parts of the world, we do all treat things differently, and it's nice to be able to sort of combine some of those types of treatments, and you get much better doing that. We get to see many great places. I love London as a city. I love going to Wimbledon. I try and put that on my calendar every year if I can. New York's a fun place. Acapulco, having a tournament on the beach where you don't start until 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you've got the morning off. We get to see some good places. There is some places that you prefer not to go to, and you still have to do some of those tournaments. But we do get to visit a lot of great places, which is a very privileged lifestyle. For me, probably the biggest thing was the work-life balance, though. To be able to travel for a chunk of time, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then come home and do 2 or 3 weeks at home where you're a full-time person at home and you don't have to do too much work, and you can catch up on doing your wife's washing for her and cooking for her and that sort of things. That's a good payback. So my day when I'm at home now is I wake up in the morning and I check my phone, see what emails have come in. If I don't have to act on anything, I look outside. Nice and sunny today. I think I'll go for a bike ride first. or a walk along the beach, breakfast with my wife down at Parkdale Cafe, that sort of thing. So as a work-life balance, that's a really good thing. You also get a great opportunity to see some places outside of tennis. The picture on the left, obviously, the Great Wall of China. I stayed for a few days afterwards. The company is quite happy for you to stay on, not use their accommodation, but certainly still use their airfare. So I've had some good holidays that I've attached onto some of my work trips. And of course, we can get the titles. We work for an American company. You don't get any better titles than working for an American company. So I started as a physio, and then I became a senior physio, and then I became a director of medical services, and all within 10 years I've become a senior director of medical services and a senior physio. Taking on some of those senior roles, I have changed my work structure a little bit. I don't do 22 weeks on the road anymore. I do a lot more administration. So my job is the perfect job now. I have 16 weeks of tournaments. 3 weeks of that are in Melbourne for the Australian Open. I can't get out of that given that it's in Melbourne. Plus I do a week of meetings in Florida each year. I have a boss who does most of the work, and I check his work because he's not a great manager and he doesn't delegate it to me. But that's okay. I don't mind spending plenty of time at home and doing some projects when I need to do some projects. That's my beach at home. That's where I walk along the beach or run along the beach many days when I'm at home. So my current duties, I've got quite a number of hats. Treatment in the rooms is the absolute priority, and I still love doing that. It's still a great bunch of guys to work with. They appreciate what we do. We keep them on court really well. And it is still practicing at the pinnacle of my profession. So I'm not going to give that up if I can help it. Court calls, the stuff that Ken was talking about when you see me out on court, that's a very small part of our practice, but it's probably the most visible part. Scheduling, as I said, we've got 19 guys, we've got 64 tournaments through the year. We have to do a lot of scheduling. There's a lot of mixing and matching. We do allow guys to put in their wish list, and we try and accommodate that as best possible. So working out the year of scheduling is quite demanding, takes a bit of time. I also do the travel budget and then approve guys' expenses. We have an electronic system. Guys submit their expenses over the internet. I get to look at all their receipts online and say whether or not they were good expenses or whether they need to readjust them a little bit. Generally, the company is very good at accepting what we put in as expenses, though. We also have an online medical records system that I administer. Quite scary, but up until only 6 or 7 years ago, we still had handwritten notes, and they are really brief handwritten notes. Whether that would have stacked up in a court of law, probably doubtful. So we have a system now that's a little bit cumbersome, but requires a little bit of management, and we have to have these little security tokens that are registered to each doctor each week so that they can get on the system and see what the history of their player is. Of course, it has to be highly confidential, and there's layers of security, so there's always something to do with that. Team building, one of those esoteric things. As I said, we've got a team of 19. We've got to keep everyone on the straight and narrow, make sure they're all working towards the same goals. We all say there's no I in team, and we have to make sure those people who do have an I in team change their way of thinking. Last but not least is relationship building. 64 tournaments around the world, that means we've got a whole lot of doctors that help us out. And they're local doctors, so we need to build relationships with them and be in touch with them through the year with developments that do happen. Also amongst other people who are in tournaments. The tournament director is someone that we should get to know quite well, because he is the one who has the power over setting up our room. If we want a table that does go up and down well and is comfortable for the players, we need to make sure that he knows that that's what we need. And I'll be able to show you an interesting picture about one of those tables in one of the further slides. Court calls. Okay. Well, unfortunately, generally it is a fail, fail, fail situation. 80% of guys who call us to court will lose. And we do publicise that, so we try and make sure that they don't call us. They lose because something is going wrong and the other guy is going to be more fit and healthy and able to run out the match. This is probably the most recent in your mind, most clear. Chung playing Federer in the semi-finals. People have paid $500 a ticket that night, and he finishes at 5-2 in the second set after not much more than an hour. And I was the last one to see him on court. There's never many positive remarks said about the trainer when that happens. However, people don't know, and I'm glad that he actually tweeted the next photo, they don't know what's really going on. It just appeared like he stopped. I'd seen him a couple of changes before. We had retaped his feet, put a little bit more padding on, but people don't realise that he'd had these blisters for the last few matches. He'd actually had local anaesthetic injection put into them before each of the last two matches, and the local just wasn't working as well as it needed to work when he came up against Roger, because that's what his foot looked like. That was his foot that was worse, but the other one wasn't much better. So these guys have to deal with quite a bit, and we can only do what we can do with something like that. So there are challenges, as you can see. I was asked to tell a few stories as well, and given that this is a bit of a boys' club and my work is a little bit of a boys' club, I thought I'd let you in on a couple of the stories that are not meant to get out there. I did a court call with these two Americans, Sam Querry and John Isner. They were playing doubles in Indian Wells. It was one of the outside courts, but Indian Wells is a lovely location and there's quite a big crowd at most of the courts out there. I had a court call and I can't remember, I think it might have been for John. I think I might have been doing some tape on his knee or something like that. And as we're going through taping him up, all they wanted to tell me was about the girl in the red across the other side of the court. They said, "You've got to sit behind us at change events. Just stay here for a change. We don't think she's got any knickers on." So yes, they're professional tennis players, but they're still boys. They're still obviously looking around at what's going on. I did check, but my eyes aren't that good. Andy Roddick and I have a long history ever since being a junior at the Australian Open. We've shared quite a few moments on court. One of them was in Shanghai. It was in his retirement year, so it was probably about his second or third last tournament. And Andy is an unbelievable competitor. He just does not want to lose anything. As a little background to this, in the boys' locker room, we're often waiting for girls to finish their matches, and we see them have court calls. And I don't know if any of you guys have noticed, but an awful lot of girls seem to have their thigh strapped, one or both, and quite often you just don't know what it's for. Anyway, Andy had actually strained his groin, so up high in the thigh, and I went out and he said, "Look, it happened before," and we'd actually treated it a little bit earlier before he played. He said, "I don't know what I can do, what do you recommend?" And I said, "Well, we should take a time out and at least massage through it a little bit to see if we can loosen it up." So we did that. We took 3 minutes, and then while we're taking that 3 minutes, we were having a chat. What else can we do? Is there anything else to help me get through to the next round? I said, "We can probably tape your thigh. That might give it a bit of compression support." And he just said, "Fuck." I said, "I'd never do a WTA tape ever." But we did. There was another time with Andy at an Australian Open once. He was playing late and he just lost a second set tie break. So he lost 2 tie breaks in a row. And Andy had never lost 2 tie breaks in a row, and I wasn't called to treat him, but I was standing courtside because I think it was a semi-final, quarter-final or a semi-final. Anyway, he went to get changed. He sweats profusely, so he wanted to change his clothes, and he walked off the court, and he said something about never lost 2 tie breaks in a row, but not in exactly those words. Anyway, Andy wears ankle braces, so he was taking some time to change socks and everything else. It was mostly just to cool down, and it was Peter Bellinger's last year as referee. Anyway, Peter went into Andy and tried to hurry him up, and Peter later told me that it's the first time someone's ever told me as a referee to fuck off. This one with Marcos Bagdatis at the Australian Open, that was also against Leighton Hewitt. It wasn't particularly funny because this happened at about 3:30 a.m. We started at about 11:30 and it was a 5-set match. Fortunately, he saved himself a little bit, so his ankle wasn't too bad. I did take him up. We've always had a bit of fun together. I think he was 2 sets to 1 down at the time. He kept playing, won the next set, looked over at me, laughed, because that meant that it was going into a 5th set at 3:45 in the morning. And I think I mouthed something to him which he understood quite clearly, and he laughed back as well. Not a court call, but we do tournaments at all sorts of places, and not everything goes right all the time. This was in Beijing, just showing that the building structure is not always what it's cracked up to be. That was my physio room in partial decay. And this was my fantastic electric high-low table in Belgrade. I swear that that word at the bottom says World War II, but that's what I had to work on for the rest of the week. They did try and get another table for me, and they did bring it in, and it did go up and down, but it was actually just a hospital bed that went up and down, so it didn't get much better. Andre Agassi, I was around just at the tail end of his career, and I think it was at the Tour finals in Shanghai. We'd already lost 2 or 3 players from our final event of the year, and he wasn't looking great. He had a really bad neck, couldn't turn his head at all. The other physio who I was there with had been working with him and just wasn't getting anywhere, and I was reasonably good at manipulating necks. So we had a look at him and decided that it was worth a manipulation. So got him relaxed, worked on the joint a little bit, told him about what it was going to be, and then turned his head the right way, gave it a big crack, and he sat up and said, "That feels fantastic, but if you ever do that to me again, I'm going to fucking kill you." So that's the sort of thing that that can happen on tour. I'm sure there's plenty of questions about other things, and quite happy to try and enlighten you on other stuff.
You've got the. I'm going to ask the first question. President's prerogative. Paul, this year we saw 3 of the top 5 or 6 players. That was Murray, Nadal, and Djokovic. They all didn't get to they all either had to withdraw, and I think Murray didn't even get to Melbourne. Is there something happening in the top ranks? Are they overplaying, or was it just coincidence?
I think we need to put it in perspective. We do have times, like I was talking about that Tour finals with Agassi. That year we lost 4 out of the top 8 guys from that tournament. Now, we're thinking, what's going on? We didn't lose one person for the next 7 years. So it was a glitch. This year, with the Australian Open, or even if you look at last year, the second half of last year, we had a whole lot of guys pull out for the rest of the year. I think tennis has become an increasingly physical game, But also sports science has become a whole lot better too. So our treatments are better, recovery methods are better, nutrition methods are better. Players are playing a lot longer. Back in the day, I don't know if people can remember what age that Pete Sampras retired at, and he was an old man at the time. I think he was 31, maybe. Now you're looking at all of these guys being 32, 34. The average age of the top 100 used to be 24 when I started. It's now almost 28. So guys are playing longer, and older bodies are just going to break down more often.
Alan.
Paul, is there an equivalent team of female physios, or do you work with women as well?
The two tours are very separate. A lot of people think that they're very close together because you basically only see the Grand Slams on TV. We probably only have 10 or 15 events out of those 64 that are combined events. So they have a completely separate structure to us, and there is an equivalent team of WTA physios, yes.
That's your show.
Paul, following on the same question that you've already been asked, whose decision is it when someone's injured, as we were showing there with Chung and some of the others, to stop playing? You don't make that decision? Do you make a recommendation?
Quite often the players will ask us, what should I do? But more often than not, they know that they can't play at their best. And if they don't play at their best, they're going to lose fairly quickly. Like Chung was down 6-1, 5-2. I think he probably would have lost the third set 6-1 as well. He was never going to get through. So for his future and recovery, it was probably better for him to stop. We have debates on court. There are very, very few times that we tell a player you have to stop, or if they don't want to stop.
Could I just ask a supplementary? Mr. Nadal complains about the court surface. Has it not got something to do with the way he plays rather than the surface? Because it doesn't seem to do Federer any damage.
Yeah, it's a really interesting call with the different surfaces that we play on and the different effects they have on bodies. And you can go either way on that. Like, you could say, okay, well, hard courts are going to be a little bit more jarring, but then guys are sliding on hard courts as well, and also your footing is a lot better on hard courts than it is on clay. Clay courts, the matches tend to go a lot longer because it's a slower surface. So I think there's always going to be fingers pointed by guys who lose or have an injury because they're disappointed at the time and they shoot from the hip.
Thank you. With regard to these days, the sophisticated footwear that the players use, I was a bit surprised to see the ultimate mess that fellow players' feet were in. How would you explain that? I mean, it's just constant work or something?
It's interesting with footwear. Chung is a young guy. He's probably only just signed a sponsorship with someone. They provide him his footwear and he doesn't know what it's necessarily like, and it may not suit him. There's a young American kid, Riley Opelka. He should be a very good player. His development has been slow because he took a sponsorship as he was rising up the ranks quickly with a different company, and he ended up with stress fractures in his feet because the shoes just didn't suit him. But you know, when you're 19 or 20 and $1 million contract is offered to you, you think, well, the shoes can't be that bad, can they? The other side of things also is environmental conditions can change quickly. Indian Wells is coming up. That's my next tournament in a couple of weeks' time, and that's in the desert of California. Guys go there every year and they never have any trouble with their hands, but all of a sudden their hands are dry and they get cracks and blisters. Same thing with feet. You can get similar sorts of reactions like that, or if you're in a particularly humid climate 2 weeks later in Miami and your socks get really sweaty and your toes rub together more than they would normally rub together, and you end up with blisters like that. And it's not always explainable. With Chung though, he's a new fella. It was the first time he'd played that many 5-set matches or best of 5 matches. He didn't know how to look after the calluses on his feet. He runs an awful lot. He needs to take a lot more care of shaving down his calluses so that the calluses don't rub and create blisters. So there's an education process in some of it.
Jess Barry, why do our fully trained AFL players and some of our running athletes keep getting hamstrings? And the second part of the question, I noticed that the women footballers are starting to get cruciate knee problems, apart from what our AFL players do. Do you think the women's knees are a bit weaker than ours? And you notice when the girls were doing the aerial skiing, they had a lot of problem landing. They were doing the bum touching in the snow, and the men in the finals were basically upright.
That last statement hits the nail on the head for the knee injuries in women's sport. It has been shown that when you land, there are certain mechanisms of landing that are safe and some that are not safe. And men, for whatever reason, learn to land properly. Women do not. So they don't have the correct landing mechanism, and that's where they do a lot of their cruciate ligaments. That's been studied fairly closely in netball. So there's a big push in lower level women's sport, as in junior women's sport, to try and get them to do specific drills which help them with their jumping and landing. With respect to hamstrings, in fact, with respect to any injury, your biggest predictor of having an injury is having had a previous injury. So I think the statistics for a hamstring injury is once you've had one, you're 60% more likely to have another one compared to someone who has not had one. And there are so many different reasons for hamstrings or calf injuries to occur, and it's not always easy to work out what the combination of factors is, whether it's hamstring strength, hamstring flexibility, back strength, nerve mobility, back degeneration. So there's a lot of research to be done, but it's difficult to research humans.
What about the fact that football boots don't have a heel?
I think the new fashion football boots are probably as good as they can be. They're much more like runners now than what they used to be in the old days. So you might not think they have a heel, but they probably have a bit of a heel. And I think it will be very much individual as to whether a player feels he needs to have a heel, or whether the physio looks at the mechanics of his ankle and knee and hip joint to work out what's best for him.
Thank you.
You mentioned $1 million sponsorships. Could you tell us something about how much the player actually keeps?
I don't know exactly. In general, money in tennis has increased a lot in the last 5 years. The players were pretty close to boycotting the Australian Open a number of years ago because their percentage of prize money compared to the revenue was very low. Prize money has gone up. Sponsorship is returning to quite high levels. There was a period after the GFC that a lot of players didn't have sponsors, but I think that is returning. And the other thing with tennis, by chance, is that tennis is a good sport for advertising because there are so many breaks in play. Live tennis is really good for advertising, so sponsorship has gone up. The player arrangement with their manager will determine what they end up with for out of that sponsorship. At a guess, I think the player manager probably takes around 10%.
Tax.
Thanks, Jeff.
hamstrings, all right? Paul, thank you. This has been a wonderful coverage. I was interested to hear you comment about the relationships that you need to have with other physios, of course, but also doctors, local doctors and things. When looking at that Chung incident, it appeared that there was line ball there as to whether there could have been a medical opinion as well with the extent of those blisters. Sure, the physio is important in analysing the cause of that, but once it's there, so do you ever need to relate immediately and get a second opinion, so to speak, on court?
I don't think it was clear on that photo, but the doctor was actually there on court with me. And certainly for big matches, we try and have the doctors come out for all of those injuries. The foot was like that, or both feet were like that before the match actually started. The doctor had done the injection. I was sitting on court with the doctor during the match, and we discussed that there was probably nothing else we could actually do. We were most concerned about the right blister. The left foot had seemed to recover during the tournament quite well. But when he called me out, it was his left foot that was hurting more because he didn't get an injection in that for the first time for a few matches beforehand. So it is a team approach, and often we've already worked out what needs to be done before the player actually calls.
One last question. And
Paul, heat is a perennial problem at the Australian Open, and it's been discussed at great length, I know, for some time, and they've got milestones in now that are meant to dictate whether play should continue. It seems to me to be an enormous request of the player to play in some of the conditions that I've seen. I was there as a spectator on one occasion when it was hard work just sitting in the shade, and the thought of playing in those conditions seemed to me to be completely unreasonable. Are there any sort of long-term health consequences for players that are asked to play in what seem to me to be extreme conditions?
One of the biggest problems we have with heat is research. We just don't have enough information about what it does to athletic performance. Statistically, no one dies from heat, generally, at a professional level. So that's a good thing. We had a change of doctor crews at the Australian Open this year. The previous one retired. The attitude of the doctor from previous years was shaped by the fact that he also was a doctor for the Hawaiian Ironman, where it is extremely hot temperatures and the guys are swimming, cycling and running for more than 8 hours. And his opinion was that those guys don't have any real issues and they get dehydrated and they don't cramp very much at all. So these guys playing in similar or less heat for a less time shouldn't have any trouble. However, the new crew this year, unknown to many, had some meteorological devices planted at actually on court for some of the stadium courts. In the past we had always judged on the Bureau of Meteorology station, which is at Melbourne Park, but it's not on court anywhere, it's out in the public area. So what we've found for the first time this year was that the readings on court are very different from what the readings that the Bureau have. And I think the heat rule will be changed in future years, and we'll probably see more delays in play and breaks in play. I don't know if any of you watched the women's and the men's finals. The women played on the Saturday evening, so no direct sunlight. It was 28 degrees, which is not hot, but it was highly humid. And they had a lot of trouble. Their heat rule was in. The roof was open. The heat rule was in, which means that the women can get a 10-minute heat break between the second and third set, if it goes into a third set. And they did take that 10-minute heat break. One of the players that night ended up in hospital with dehydration and just not feeling well. And she played a lot of matches, and some of them very long and very tough. But that certainly shaped what happened the next night, which was close to 10 degrees warmer and similar humidity. So the roof was closed, basically because the doctor said, I don't want any of my players falling over and dying tonight because it's much worse than what it was last night. On the whole though, just on heat, a lot of players train to be good in the heat. Some guys are just not that great in the heat. Tennis is also an individual sport, so we don't have control over what a lot of the guys do as far as their sweat testing goes. So some guys just aren't that well trained, and they're not well prepared. They don't eat the right things, and they don't drink the right fluids, and they've never been sweat tested. They don't even know how hydrated they actually are. So for a professional sport, there's a lot of very amateurish ideas that are going around out there.
Well, I'm sure we could go on with a lot more questions, but time is marching on. I'll ask Andy Coogan to propose a vote of thanks to Paul.
It's been a tremendously interesting presentation. I think we all agree on that. There's so many different aspects of your work that are so intriguing and, as I said, interesting for us to hear about. It's also nice to know that you're welcome. Welcome back. And on behalf of Probus and Morris, I'd like to thank you very much for making this most interesting presentation.
I will be staying for lunch, so if anyone has any other questions, I'm quite happy to field them over lunch.